Okay, let's talk about the next major committee in the House of Representatives, and that's going to be Ways and Means. The Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives is the Tax Committee. It's responsible for writing the tax laws. You might think that representatives would want to avoid being on the Tax Committee because their constituents might look at them and say, "Oh, that's the guy that passes those tax bills that we don't like." But in actuality, the Ways and Means Committee is highly sought after. Because when a member is on the Ways and Means Committee, what they tend to do is they try to carve out special exemptions and loopholes that benefit specific industries and occupations that are important in their state or district. So that's why definitely one reason why people want to be on the Ways and Means Committee. Armed Services. Members of the House of Representatives want to be on the Armed Services Committee because they want to try to protect the bases and weapon systems that are important to their state or districts. They want to make sure that the base doesn't shut down, or that the weapon system isn't stopped, or maybe they want to encourage the building of a new weapon system that would be built or based in their district. So members of the House of Representatives definitely want to be on Armed Services. Okay, let's take a look at the Senate committees. First committee in the Senate that we want to talk about is the Appropriations Committee. It's important in the Senate for the same reason as the Appropriations Committee is in the House. Members of the Senate want to be on Appropriations because that's the spending committee. Specifically, that's how they're going to want to be on that, so they can begin to craft pork barrel legislation or earmarks that will benefit their state. Next major committee is the Finance Committee. That's the Tax Committee in the Senate, and members of the Senate want to be on it for the same reason as members of the House want to be on the House Ways and Means Committee. If you'll recall, tax bills have to start in the House, so the Finance Committee isn't quite as important as the House Ways and Means Committee, but it's still very important and highly sought after by members of the Senate. Judiciary Committee. Senate Judiciary Committee is responsible for considering all proposed laws that would be federal criminal laws. Next committee is the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Senate Judiciary Committee is responsible for several things. First, any law that proposes a federal crime or changes to federal criminal law is going to go through the Senate Judiciary Committee. But that's not necessarily why members of the Senate want to be there. No one really gains any political points by being on or by writing legislation that makes something a crime or stiffens the penalty for something. That's not really why people want to be on the Judiciary Committee. The real reason why people in the Senate want to be on the Judiciary Committee is because of the nominations that the Senate has to consider. First, the U.S. Constitution gives the President the power to appoint judges subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. So when the President makes a nomination to a judge, to any federal court, that goes to the Senate. Before the full Senate considers the nomination, it goes first to the Judiciary Committee. And it is doubtful that if the Judiciary Committee recommends that the Senate reject the nomination, it's doubtful that person would be confirmed. So the people on the Judiciary Committee kind of get to take a first look at all presidential nominations to the Judiciary. The next thing is that the President gets to appoint a whole lot of people that deal with criminal law enforcement. For example, the Director of the FBI, the Solicitor General, the U.S. Attorney General, U.S. attorneys, and a whole host of other people that are very powerful individuals who run organizations that possess what we call coercive force. Those appointments made by the President have to be approved by the Senate. Before the full Senate approves them, they first go again to the Judiciary Committee. And in a similar manner to judges, the Judiciary Committee reviews the nomination and makes a recommendation to the full Senate to confirm the nomination or to reject it. So because of the nominations the Senate gets, and the fact that they go to the Judiciary Committee, that's why people in the Senate want to be on the Judiciary Committee, not necessarily because of the legislation the Judiciary Committee considers. Armed Services. Members of the Senate want to be on the Armed Services Committee for several reasons. First off, for protecting bases and weapon systems, very similar to the Armed Services Committee and the House of Representatives. But in addition to that, the Senate Armed Services Committee could serve as a platform for a senator to articulate their foreign policy and military policy ideas. This could set the stage for a future run for the White House. So this allows the member of the Senate to gain some sort of foreign policy credential. Another reason why members of the Senate want to be on Armed Services Committee is because all civilian leaders of the military, such as Secretary of Defense, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Air Force, and so on, appointed by the President, they are confirmed by the Senate, and before that, they will first go to Armed Services Committee. So presidential nominations for civilian leadership of the military that have to be approved by the Senate go first to Armed Services Committee. Another one is going to be commissioned officers. The President has the authority under the Constitution to commission officers, but those commissions have to be approved by the Senate before the full Senate votes. They again go to Armed Services Committee. In reality, the Senate really doesn't take a hard look at anybody who's going to be, let's say, a second lieutenant. It's pretty much a perfunctory confirmation, but for higher officers such as generals and so forth, the Senate's going to take a hard look at those individuals. Also, it should be noted major changes of command have to be approved by the Senate, and all of those would also go to Armed Services. Foreign Relations Committee. Members of the Senate wish to be on the Foreign Relations Committee because the Senate has some unique powers relating to foreign policy. Senate has to approve presidential appointments to the diplomatic corps, such as ambassadors, Secretary of State, and so forth. Also, the Senate has to ratify treaties, and those nominations and those treaties will go first to the Foreign Relations Committee. In a similar vein to the Armed Services Committee, members of the Senate want to be on Foreign Relations Committee because it again serves as a platform for them to talk about foreign policy that might serve as a framework for them to stage their future presidential run. Okay, legislative process. The Constitution of the United States stipulates that bills can start in either house except for tax bills. So bills can start in either house, but tax bills have to start in the House of Representatives. The reason why the Constitution says that is the framers believed that the House of Representatives was the chamber in the Congress that was closest to the people. This is because at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, only the House of Representatives was directly elected. The Senate at the time was appointed by state legislatures, and that was the case until the passage of the 17th Amendment. When a bill is introduced in the House of Representatives, well, let's back up. For a bill to be introduced in the House of Representatives, a member basically has to put their name on it and drop it in the hopper in the House of Representatives. Where did the bill come from? In reality, it probably came from the President, the bureaucracy, or a special interest group. Members of Congress, while they have the legal authority to write legislation and introduce it, in reality they don't. They take legislation that is largely written by other people, put their name on it, and introduce it for them. Again, most legislation that Congress considers comes from either the White House, some bureaucratic agency, or a special interest group. The bill will be then assigned to a committee by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Each committee has a different jurisdiction, and the Speaker has the authority to decide which committee it goes to. If there's, maybe a bill might go rightfully to one committee or to another, there might be an overlap. The Speaker decides which committee it's assigned to. Each committee is presided over by a chairman who is appointed by the majority party, usually according to the seniority rule. Okay, once the committee gets the bill, the next stop is subcommittee. And during the subcommittee phase, that's where the bulk of legislative work is going to take place. Two basic processes will occur at the subcommittee phase. The first one is going to be hearings, and the second one is going to be markup. During the hearing phase, that's when members of the subcommittee will gather testimony from interested parties, such as other members of Congress, but usually it will be lobbyists and representatives from the bureaucratic agency that is responsible for enforcing the particular piece of legislation. Occasionally, you might also see members of the public give testimony in front of the committee. The next thing that happens during the committee phase is what's called markup. During the markup phase, members of the committee will take out provisions of the proposed bill, take parts out, put parts in, rewrite, combine two or three bills that say the same basic thing together, and so forth. It's amending the bill, changing the bill to make it into a form that might be appealing to a majority of the House of Representatives. After the subcommittee phase is done, it's then referred back to the full committee. The full committee can schedule more hearings and markup, but in reality they probably won't do very much with it if the subcommittee did its job. Once the committee is done with the piece of legislation, it then goes to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee of the House of Representatives, as previously stated, is the most powerful committee in the House. And if we look at both houses together, it's the most powerful committee in both the House and the Senate. Rules Committee in the House of Representatives is responsible for placing the bill on the calendar, which is the schedule, to decide, decides when the bill is going to come up. The Rules Committee obviously is controlled by the majority party and is responsive to majority party leadership. So scheduling in the House is a cooperative effort between the Speaker, the Majority Leader, and the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is also going to write a rule that dictates how that piece of legislation will be considered. As previously mentioned, the rule could be open, closed, or modified. And they also write a rule that relates to debate time, but that's not quite as important as whether the Rules Committee allows the bill to be amended or not. Once the Rules Committee has placed the bill on the calendar and at the scheduled time, the bill will be considered by the full House of Representatives. When the House considers when the full House considers the bill, there'll be a debate, and debate will be limited based upon the rules stipulated in the rules, based upon the rules stipulated by the Rules Committee, and the bill may or may not be allowed to be amended, again, depending upon the rule issued by the Rules Committee. If the bill is allowed to be amended, then all amendments must be germane. One more time, if the bill is allowed to be amended based upon the rules issued by the Rules Committee, then all submitted amendments to the piece of legislation must be germane. Germane means related to. So all amendments must somehow relate to the content or the subject of the bill. After the bill is done in the House of Representatives, it requires a majority vote to advance. So assuming that it's voted on and approved by the majority, it's then sent to the Senate. And the process in the Senate is, for our purposes, very similar to the House. The bill will be introduced, and once it's introduced, it'll be assigned to a standing committee. We'll go from a standing committee to a subcommittee, and they'll do hearings and markup, and whenever the subcommittee is done with it, they will report it back to the full committee, who could do more hearings and markup, but typically won't. Then there is no real Rules Committee in the Senate. Technically, there's something called the Committee on Rules and Administration, but it bears no resemblance to the House Committee, to the House Rules Committee. So we're not going to worry about it. So for purposes of this course, there is no Senate Rules Committee. So when does the bill come up, and under what procedures will the bill be considered? These questions are usually answered by what's called a unanimous consent agreement. A unanimous consent agreement is an agreement entered into, in this instance, between the majority leader and the minority leader. They agree when the bill is going to come up and under what conditions the bill would be considered. Can this unanimous consent agreement restrict debate? It sure can. So not every bill that comes up in the Senate can be subject to the filibuster. Okay, both the majority and minority party could agree to end debate at a prescribed time, and this would be written out in the unanimous consent agreement. And while I said that this is an agreement between the majority leader and the minority leader, it's not an equal partnership. It's not that they're sitting down on an equal playing field. Obviously, the majority leader has a lot more to say about it than the minority leader does. Then the bill is considered by the full Senate. When considering the bill in the Senate, the typical answer or the typical debate rule is no limit. The senators can talk for as long as they want. Obviously, that could give rise to a filibuster, which means talking a bill to death. The way you would end a filibuster is to invoke cloture, and that would require 60 votes, or 3/5 of the Senate. The Senate also allows non-germane amendments. This is different than the House. In the Senate, amendments do not have to relate to the bill. These non-germane amendments are called riders. And what that does is it opens up the bill to pretty much any type of amendment by any senator.